You are watching Macro TV. We are busy with Study Unit 3 and Chapter 6 in Fourie and Burger. We are now introducing the so-called ADAS model, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply in the economy. In our basic models thus far, in other words, in the Keynesian 45-degree line model and in the ISLM model, we assume that the supply side will always respond to a change in demand. So if there's an increase in demand due to an increase in government spending, we just assumed that income will also increase. Similarly, we assume that the price level is constant, and we will now relax both of these assumptions in our ADAS model. Now, the 45-degree diagram and the ISLM-BP diagrams can be summed up in the aggregate demand graph. So the AD curve represents the whole dynamic of the ISLM-BP. The aggregate supply, on the other hand, shows the behavior of firms and workers that produce the output of the economy. And this AS curve has a positive slope. Now, on the vertical axis, we have the price level, and on the horizontal axis, output or income in the economy. The AD curve shows all the combinations of income and price level in which there is simultaneous equilibrium in the real and the monetary sectors. So IS and LM equilibrium are now put into the single AD curve. And there are two ways of deriving it, and I'll briefly introduce both of them. If you use the Keynesian 45-degree line, you can start with an equilibrium over here at the income level Y0 and the price level P0. And we know that these sort of expenditure items of our model were always expressed in real terms. So we have to now, if there's a price change, divide by the price. So if prices go up, real spending decreases, and you can see the aggregate spending line moving slightly down, and total spending. And this is associated with a lower level of income that you plot on the graph below. So at a price P0, you have output of or incomes of Y0, but then if prices go up to P1, income is less at Y1. And you find this negative relationship between price and income shown by the AD curve. You can also use the ISLM-BP, and now it's a story of the real demand for money and the real supply of money that lies behind the LM curve. So at an initial equilibrium 0 and the income level Y0, you can have an equilibrium, but then if prices go up to P1, the LM curve moves to the left and the level of income is lower at this higher price level. And again, you find this negative relationship between price and income, and that gives you the slope of the AD curve, or the aggregate demand in the economy. So if prices are higher, our incomes are lower from the view of aggregate demand. So does this negative slope make sense? And there are a number of reasons why this is very sensible. If you consider the interest rate effect, an increase in the price level means that the real money supply is decreased. That forces up interest rates, and then investment is lower, and then total spending decreases. So you have this negative relationship between the higher price and income. The same is true for the wealth effect. If prices are higher, the real value of assets are lower. So people feel less rich and they spend less, and then income is lower. The foreign trade effect is that if domestic prices increase, that means exports are now more expensive, they decrease, the trade balance decreases, and total spending decreases, which means a lower level of income. In the tax effect, higher tax or higher incomes, when prices increase incomes and it forces taxpayers into higher tax brackets, they end up with less disposable income and less spending and a lower level of income in the economy as a whole. And finally, when we get to the real income effect, it's again very sensible. At a higher price level, the real value of people's incomes are lower, they spend less, and the output or the income of the economy as a whole is less. So this negative relationship between price and income that is shown by the AD curve makes a lot of sense. So what would shift the AD curve? First thing to note is that a change in price does not shift the curve. That is a movement along the curve, where the curve as a whole can shift to the right if there's something that stimulates spending, for example, an increase in investment or an increase in government spending, or it can shift to the left if there's a contraction, either contractionary monetary policy or fiscal policy or a global slowdown. Anything that dampens economic activity moves the whole AD curve to the left. Now, typically, changes in your ISLM model should be mirrored by what happens with the AD curve. And the following graph shows that quite nicely. So you're already familiar with this top part of the diagram, and it's contractionary monetary policy illustrated by the ISLM BP. Now, if you start off at the equilibrium 0 over here with an income level Y0, that is mirrored by a point on the AD curve, aggregate demand down here. Now, let's start it off and say you have contractionary monetary policy. The repo rate increases and it moves the LM curve from LM0 to LM1, and you end up with an equilibrium at point 1. Now, we already know higher interest rates means less investment, which means less aggregate spending and a decrease in income to Y1. At the same time, those higher interest rates means that there is an inflow of money into the financial account of the balance of payments. The lower incomes also means that there is less spending on imports, and that means that you have a surplus on the trade balance of the balance of payments. So at equilibrium 1, you have equilibrium between the LM1 and the original IS0, but you are above and to the left of the BP curve, which means that there still needs to be an adjustment to equilibrium. And this contraction is then showed by a contraction of the AD curve over here to the left. Now, we already know how these adjustments work. The first one is through the money supply. So because there's a surplus on the balance of payments, that means that there's going to be an inflow of money and an increase in the money supply. This increase in the money supply reduces the interest rates. As you can see, this move from 1 to 2 over here. That means that there's going to be a small increase in investment, and that's an increase in demand. So the aggregate demand curve moves to the right over here, and that's at a now slightly higher level of income, Y2. Now, we also know that as incomes increase, that means that there's increased spending on imports, and you are reducing that surplus on the current account of the balance of payments over here at point 2. But it's still not a final equilibrium. You're still above the original BP curve, which means that there also has to be an adjustment through the exchange rate. So because you have the surplus on the balance of payments, you have an appreciation of the exchange rate, and the result of that is a decrease in exports, an increase in imports. The IS curve moves to the left from IS0 to IS1. At the same time, that means that the BP curve also moves. You're now reducing that surplus on the current account, and because interest rates are decreasing, you're also reducing the surplus on the financial account. And the economy, the aggregate demand shrinks a little bit to the left again, and you end up at an equilibrium Y3. So the point is that all the changes that you would typically model in your ISLM BP framework are also reflected in movements of the AD curve. You can see contractionary monetary policy leads to a decrease in income, and you can exactly see how that contractionary monetary policy reduces aggregate demand in the economy. This video introduced the ADAS model and explained the derivation of the AD curve using two methods. In the next video, we'll look at the AS curve, the supply side of this economy. Stay tuned.